This is Homeschool 101, a collaboration between ABS Television and the Ministry of Education. Stay attentive and attempt all activities. And now, today's lesson.
Welcome to Homeschool 101. My name is Nikisha Smith, and I'll be teaching you Caribbean Studies. Today, we'll be going through another topic in the Caribbean Studies syllabus, social justice. On completing this section, you'll be able to explain the relationship between social justice, human rights, equity, equality, and discrimination. Examine cases of social justice on the grounds of age, gender, and ethnicity. And within that, you have race, class, and religion. And finally, explain how breaches of social justice impact on development in the Caribbean. Let's get started. So first of all, what is social justice? It's a complex issue. And it's also based on the premise that all people are entitled to the same basic rights and freedoms as everybody else. And this is regardless of what gender they are, what age they are, and what race they are. Social justice is connected with issues of equality and equity, which we will explain later on. Justice is not only the administration of laws of a country, but also refers to economic status. So this means that justice is related to what are the sorts of things that people can do in terms of money. Now, so that makes justice related to poverty. It is also based on the idea of a society which gives individuals and groups fair treatment and a just share of the benefits of society. So a society in which all of the money is in the hands of a few people, that's not going to be a just society. Continuing with what is social justice, it is giving people their due, what they deserve. So if you work, you should get a fair wage and not be taken advantage of. It is also equal participation of all groups in a society that is mutually shaped to meet their needs. So one group should not have more privileges than another group. Society is grounded on a social contract that we sign as human beings with each other to follow certain rules and common principles. The contract is only as strong as the people who abide by it. If that contract is deemed to be broken because of class, race, sex, etc., then those groups that have been infringed upon will feel betrayed and will be less inclined to uphold those principles. So it works if everyone understands the rules of the contract, everyone is treated equally and fairly, and the law enforcers enforce the principles equally and fairly. So now we'll be going into defining what is equity and what is equality. Take a look at this picture that we have here. We have two similar situations in which both groups of people are trying to achieve the same aim of looking over the fence. However, some are able to and some are not. Now, in terms of equality, this means that equal opportunities are given to everyone. But as you can see, everyone is not the same size. So even though everyone is given the same box, the goal of looking over the fence is not achieved. So if we can look at this in terms of, let's say, classes, upper class, middle class, and lower class. Now, if you give upper class people the same resources as everyone else, of course they'll be able to look over the fence. And looking over the fence in this case is going to be achieving a good quality of life. For the middle class citizen, they're given the same resources as the upper class person. They're just barely able to achieve a good quality of life, just barely looking over the fence. Now, the lower class person, because they started out at a disadvantaged starting point, even though they're given the same resources, they're still not looking over the fence. That is equality. Now, when we move to equity, This is more focused on the outcome, looking over the fence. So you're giving an equal, in this case, we're focusing on the equal outcome for all. In this case, looking over the fence. Now, because the upper class person started out in a more advantageous position, they don't need as many resources as the other groups. So they're given less from society, but they're still able to look over the fence, have a good quality of life. The middle class person, they need some more resources than the upper class person, and the lower class person needs even more to be able to look over the fence. But at the end of the day, everybody is on the same level. So this is the difference between equality and equity. Equality is giving the same resources to each group, regardless of whether they're able to achieve a good quality of life, whereas equity is looking at how many advantages does each group have. Do they need more things than the other group in order to get a good quality of life? You examine those and then give out the resources according to those statuses. That's equity. So equality, in this, there are efforts to treat everyone in a similar way. And in terms of race, there's such a thing as white privilege and black disadvantage. We'll get to that later on. But if you treat everyone in the same way, they might not be able to get to the same end goal because they might start out with less. Equity attempts to ascertain that treatment is just and fair. And in terms of fairness, we're saying we might treat you a little different, but because we know that you're starting out behind everyone else, so we're going to give you a little bit more. Okay? So equity refers to how fair the system is to persons who pass through it. So in this case, fairness and equity, they are synonymous. So now we're going into the development of social justice in the Caribbean. So slavery and forced labor were not regarded as wrong by the colonialists. It was a system that was meant to disadvantage the black person. Many laws were instituted in order to legalize disadvantage, such as the inability for slaves to own land, wear certain materials, interact with other races, and even simply to be on the road at a certain time of the night. So slaves were regarded as both people and property. So they were able to be sold as well. So the fundamental principles of the colonial state were exploitation, inequality, and injustice, the opposite of justice. So the principle of equality did not apply to a colonial state, but after emancipation in 1834, Caribbean people were no longer regarded as property. They were considered to be just people. And so therefore, after that, there became a movement in order to achieve the rights of regular citizens. That means the same as their white counterparts. So in 1944 and 1946, respectively, universal adult suffrage was introduced in Jamaica and Trinidad. This means the ability to vote. And with the ability to vote, you can then impact your society. Other countries were quick to follow. In 1962, Jamaica and Trinidad, they were the first countries in the English-speaking Caribbean to become independent. A Bill of Rights was included in the constitutions of both countries, and all countries that became independent also included it in their constitutions. And the Bill of Rights is a chapter in the Constitution which outlines and protects the fundamental rights and freedoms of individuals in Caribbean society. So all independent countries of the Commonwealth Caribbean, that means former English colonies, have a Bill of Rights which is enshrined or entrenched and protected in their constitutions. So the Bill of Rights is designed to perpetuate and uphold equality and social justice. We'll now take a look. Citizens have the power to redress any infringement of his or her constitutional rights in the courts. So if any of the rights are being impinged upon, you can fight for your rights. Now we're going to take a look at an excerpt from the Antigua and Barbuda Constitution, the Bill of Rights section. It says, except as is otherwise expressly provided in this Constitution, no law may abrogate, abridge, or infringe, or authorize abrogation, abridgment, or infringement of any of the fundamental rights and freedoms of the individual herein before recognized and declared. So above all, the Constitution is the first law of the land, and no other law that comes after it should infringe on those constitutional rights. So let's take a look at what are those rights. So this comes straight from our Constitution. We have the protection of right to life. So nobody should arbitrarily kill you. Seems simple, right? We have the rights, the protection of rights to personal liberty. So therefore, we should not be arbitrarily enslaved or have our freedom denied. We have protection from slavery and forced labor, the protection from inhuman treatment, the protection of freedom of movement, protection from deprivation of property. Nobody should take what is yours without, well, they shouldn't take what is yours, essentially. Protection of person or property from arbitrary search or entry. So therefore, if a police enters your property, they should have just reason, or in this case, a warrant. This is in our Constitution. We have protection of freedom of conscience. So therefore, if you're asked to do something that is against your conscience, it's in your Constitution. You don't have to do it. So this could be applied to police officers, ministers of religion, security people. You decide. We have protection of freedom of expression, including freedom of the press. So therefore, you have the right to speak about whatever you want, as long as it does not defame anyone or is a clear untruth. We have the protection of freedom of assembly and association. So therefore, you can protest, you can go to church. All these things are protected in the Constitution. Protection from discrimination on grounds of race, sex, etc. Provision to secure protection of the law. So therefore, the police should protect you. Derogations from fundamental rights and freedoms under emergency powers. So therefore, under emergency powers, these freedoms do not necessarily go away. And enforcement of protective provisions. So this pretty much goes through all of the fundamental rights that each citizen of Antigua and Barbuda has. Know your rights. So now we're going to look into particular areas where social justice applies in Caribbean societies. So the first one is gender equality. So this affects women in particular. So for example, women in politics, employment, and education. You have the highest offices in politics, religion, business, industry, medicine, law, and other spheres, and they tend to be exclusively the preserve of men. This is a breach of social justice. Women are also citizens. Why is it that they're not more female politicians? So sexism oppresses women and keeps them in a subordinate role to men. While individual women may achieve much more than some men, in society as a whole, the prevailing sexist prejudices and stereotypes continue to portray women as inferior beings, as the other in the society. And a stark fact is that women are 35% more likely to be poor than men. That's a reality. And pretty much it's because they usually get lower wages. Even in the same position, a man will be paid more than a woman. You have lack of decent work. Some types of work are apportioned for men and not for women. And you have unpaid care work. Largely in the homes, women are responsible for the household chores and also for raising the children. This does not get remunerated in terms of a salary. However, it is still work. Another area of social justice is class discrimination in terms of employment, education, and justice. We have racial discrimination, and this is according to racial groups: white, Afro-Caribbean, Indian, Chinese. So we're going to go into all of these areas. So racism. Racism is a negative or positive value placed on a group of people who belong to a particular race or have a certain skin color because they are believed to be inferior or superior. There's such a thing as positive racism. And of particular interest right now is the Black Lives Matter movement because of the George Floyd police battering murder issue that happened in America. And this is an example of racism simply because of the color of your skin. Creedism refers to any form of prejudice, stereotype, or act of discrimination based on religion. Again, such beliefs and actions are based on the idea that a particular religion is inferior or superior in some way. For a long time in the Caribbean, Rastafari experienced a lot of prejudice because of their choice to pursue their religion, and only now they're getting access to education, land rights, the ability to smoke marijuana as their religion subscribes, so these sorts of things. Classism refers to the negative or positive ways that persons of a particular socioeconomic group are portrayed. Those of high socioeconomic standing tend to be regarded as articulate, beautiful, and to have good breeding. Those of poor or working class background tend to be seen as rough, loud, and needy. And if you think about how Antigua is divided, certain parts of the country are considered to be upper class, certain parts of the country are considered to be lower class, and the attitudes towards those different areas are reflected in how people think of those areas. Minorities, Rastafarians, Caribs, and Maroons. So the Aboriginal peoples in the Caribbean, that means the first peoples of the Caribbean, even though their ancestors were the first to inhabit the region, they are marginalized or pushed to the margins of society simply because their numbers are not as big as the majority of the country. And so they have issues such as land rights, access to resources, education. These are regular problems in countries such as Belize. So in those countries you have the Garifuna, Maya Mopan, Maya Quechua. The numbers of those people are 26,000. In Dominica you have the Caribs, just 3,000. In Guyana you have the Arawaks, Caribs, and these other groups, and they just number 42,000 in comparison to the nearly 800,000 citizens in that country. In St. Vincent, you have the Caribs, just 6,000 against 113,000. And Trinidad, you have the Caribs, just 400 people. So they have a lot of trouble getting their rights recognized. Another group, another set of people who have social justice issues are the elderly and the disabled. In terms of the elderly, they are discriminated against because after you reach a certain age, you're considered to be not able to do certain things, you're pushed aside by society, and usually they're ignored. The disabled usually have issues such as access to even public buildings, being able to access schools, churches. For example, a person in a wheelchair If the place does not have a wheelchair ramp, they will not be able to get in without assistance. That severely infringes their rights to be able to freedom, to be able to go where they need to go. Another area or another set of people that have social justice issues are street people or vagrants. A lot of vagrants are not in that position by choice due to circumstances in life, whether they lost a job or whatever it is. They end up on the streets, but once they become in that position, they become invisible. The rest of society doesn't see them, and they do not want to help them. So therefore, they are still people. They're still considered humans. They do have rights. AIDS victims, or those who suffer certain diseases, they as well would suffer from social injustice issues, because just because you have HIV or AIDS, you can live with the disease and still have a full life. However, because of this disease, people would have fear, they wouldn't want to associate with them. In the past, people used to lose their jobs because they had contracted HIV. They would get abandoned, different things like that. However, due to efforts being made to speak up for the rights of this particular group, conditions are much better right now. Rights of the child. And this is a particular area that the United Nations is concerned about, because in some areas of the world, children are being forced to work in order to provide income for their families. They're being denied access to education, health. Some girls are being denied access to school simply because they are girls. And so the rights of the child are something that should be considered, especially since they cannot speak for themselves. Another area of social justice is cruel and unusual punishment. In this case, the death penalty. In the Caribbean, the death penalty has largely been taken off the books as a form of punishment, simply because it is cruel and unusual, and it does go against the constitutional rights. Even having someone in jail and saying that they're going to get the death penalty and then having them on death row for 10 years is psychological torture as well. So this is in the legal framework, this was a contested issue. Delay of execution, that was what I was referring to. So telling someone that they're going to die as a form of punishment, and then it's not being done. The Human Development Model of Development emphasizes that people are the means and end of development. So development cannot be considered to be true development unless someone experiences good from it and not at the expense of others. So human development within it is promoting social justice. Social justice is a non-material indicator of human development, and in the study of Caribbean studies, development is divided into economic, human, and sustainable, and so therefore social justice is a non-material indicator of human development. Human development is predicated on equity and inclusiveness. So if more members of the society can live a good quality of life, that's a good indicator of development of your country. Equality in educational opportunities. So this has been a social demand in the Caribbean because it's through education that your country can advance. So this means that all groups in the society would be able to access schools without any major obstacles directed at a particular group. So any race, class, or gender. So is there inequality in accessing secondary education in the Caribbean? Do all groups have access to education, primary, secondary, and tertiary? In most of the Caribbean, there are no obstacles. However, I just noted that certain groups do have some difficulties. So some obstacles to equality in secondary education: classroom space. We have so many kids, limited schools, small classrooms that were created in the 1960s when the population was much smaller. And so cramming a lot of students into a classroom is going to become an obstacle because they will not be able to get the attention that they need. You have entry requirements, primary and post-primary examinations. Although in Antigua's case, we have universal education, so people just automatically move from primary school to secondary school. You have the inability to cater for a wide variety of needs, skills, and competencies. Because of our curriculum that is largely colonial still, it has not evolved to the way it needs to be. We do not cater for the student who, let's say, they're not really book learning. Our educational system is still largely colonial and has not advanced to the where it needs to be. So it doesn't cater for the different skills and competencies of students who maybe would not prefer book learning, but would instead prefer to learn skills, hands-on, those types of competencies. And we have the inability to cater for different clientele. So some students are blind, some students are deaf, and they also need education, but our educational system has not evolved to cater for all of those groups. So the inability to provide adequate education can impact a country's development. It diminishes the quality of life for the affected persons. Individual rights may be infringed in the following situations. You have supersession in the civil service. For example, workers with less experience are promoted ahead of those with more experience for whatever reason. And then you have less pay for women doing the same job as men. That's a social justice issue. And you having wage levels that are below the minimum wage. Minimum wage means this is what's needed to have a good quality of life, yet you're paying someone below that. So how does this affect productivity? The worker who is promoted may not be able to perform the task. The aggrieved worker may refuse to cooperate and may resort to strike action, a sick out, or go slow. Women may become demotivated to actually work for promotion because they would think that there's a glass ceiling and they would not be able to advance further in their career. In the situation of a worker being paid below minimum wage, they may resort to stealing, sabotage, or go slows. And this would affect economic development. So failure to provide facilities, example ramps, special schools, buses, and job opportunities for the physically challenged reduces quality of life for the physically challenged. Failure to provide adequate help, Medicare, and relief for the elderly results in increased morbidity and mortality. So you're going to have a higher death rate of people who are older. And that in its own way would decrease human development. And workers in low-paying jobs are unable to improve their housing or standard of living, which would increase poverty in the country. So some practice questions which you can work on in your free time for CAPE. So using examples, explain why prejudice and stereotypes persist in how mainstream society relates to different ethnic groups in the Caribbean. That's a 20-mark question. And discuss the view that racism tends to occur in the Caribbean in combination with classism. We went through those different terms. That's a 30-mark question. So this has been another episode of Homeschool 101. Thank you for watching.
You've been watching Homeschool 101, a partnership between ABS Television and the Ministry of Education. Thank you for viewing this lesson. Join us again next time.